There are stories we hear once and never forget, not because they're filled with epic battles or dramatic twists, but because they feel real, like echoes of something buried in the bones of history. This is one of those stories. It begins on a dusty trail somewhere between nowhere and too far gone. A woman named Miriam, barefoot, exhausted, clinging to her baby boy. No food, no wagon. No mercy, she'd been left behind. You see, in the eyes of the wagon train she'd traveled with, Miriam wasn't a person. She was a problem, a burden. They said she lied about being a widow, said her baby would slow them down, that she wasn't worth the rations she was given. And so at sunrise, while the wind still tasted of yesterday's dust, they rode off without her. No explanation, no farewell, just silence and a trail of fading hoofprints. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be discarded? Not rejected by one person, but by a system, a group, a world that decides you're no longer worth the space you occupy. That's where Miriam's story begins. For 3 days, she wandered with nothing but her child and her will to keep moving. Then came a trader. He looked like salvation, but wasn't. He said the post needed women, said someone would take care of her. She was too weak to question it, too tired to argue. And when you've got a baby crying against your chest, fear can sound a lot like reason. They brought her to the post, a place where women were bartered, not helped. A place where names were replaced by numbers, chalked onto skirts like prices at a cattle sale. Miriam's number was 7. She wasn't the only one. There were other women there, some younger, some older, all silent, some bruised, some blinking, like they'd forgotten how to hope. And every time that gavel slammed, another was dragged across the stage. Another price shouted, $20 if she can cook, $15 for strong arms. And when they got to Miriam, they paused. She was fresh. Had a baby. Good hips, they said, like she was livestock. Have you ever felt the weight of being evaluated not as a person but as a product? Her baby clung to her, crying, not from hunger or cold, but something worse, from knowing, from sensing that something terrible was happening, even if he didn't have the words for it yet. That's the kind of fear that stays with you. But then something happened. Someone unexpected stepped out from the edge of the crowd. A man, quiet, tall, wrapped in buckskin, wearing a carved pendant that glinted silver in the sun. He didn't shout. He didn't bid like the others. He simply said, 15, I'll take her, with the child. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the chaos stopped. The room didn't get loud. It got quiet. The trader laughed, said he didn't have coin. But the man, his name was Tassan, tossed that pendant to the ground, said it was worth more than the asking price. And then he said something that stuck with her forever. She's not property. She walks with me. Because I said so. Let that sink in. He didn't say because she asked or because I want her. He said it like a shield, like a declaration. Miriam didn't know who he was. But in that moment she didn't need to, because sometimes it only takes one person to remind you that you still have worth, that you still belong to yourself. And maybe that's a question worth asking right now. In a world that still trades, people in different forms, status, titles, silent expectations, what would it mean to be seen again? Not for what you can do or give or endure, but simply for who you are. That's how this story begins, not with rescue, but with recognition, and recognition, as we'll see, is the beginning of every revolution. There are moments in a person's life when time doesn't just slow, it fractures, when every second stretches heavy with humiliation, fear, and the unbearable sense that the world has already made up its mind about who you are. That's what it was like for Miriam. She was standing barefoot on a makeshift stage at a dusty trading post, holding her baby boy like a shield. Around her were other women, some barely more than girls, others with faces hardened by years of being unseen. All of them had numbers chalked onto their skirts like prices at a market. And that's exactly what it was, a market, not for goods. For women, have you ever imagined what it would feel like to be sold in broad daylight, To hear someone assign your worth in dollars? She can cook. 20. Strong arms? 15. When the trader got to Miriam, he smirked, paused like he was about to offer something fresh to the crowd. New stock, he called out. Has a baby but good hips, likely to birth more. Then he added, we'll start at 10. A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. One man scoffed, 10's too much for a weeper. I'll give 5, if she drops the kid. That's when Miriam felt her knees weaken. Not from exhaustion, but from the weight of shame, of being reduced to something less than human. And yet, even in that moment, she didn't cry. She tightened her grip around her child, whose tiny fists were pressed against her chest, whimpering from fear he couldn't yet name. That's when it happened. A voice, deep, calm, and cutting through the heat and noise like cold water, came from the back of the crowd. 15, it said. Heads turned. He wasn't like the others. No coin pouch jangling at his side, no smirk on his lips. Just a man, still as stone, dressed in buckskin and beadwork, with long hair tied back and eyes that didn't blink. I'll take her, he said, with the child. The trader laughed. You don't have coin. The man stepped forward, pulled a silver pendant from a leather pouch, and dropped it at the trader's feet. It shimmered with tribal carvings, symbols of lineage, honor, something far more ancient than this dusty market. That's worth more than what you're asking, he said. Then, quietly but unmistakably, and she's not property. She walks with me. Because I said so. That moment, that wasn't rescue. That was defiance. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't flashy. It was something better. It was real. Because when someone speaks on your behalf without owning you, when they name your humanity in a place designed to strip it away, that's not just help. That's recognition. That's dignity returned. Miriam didn't know his name. But when his eyes met hers, something in her steadied. She didn't ask questions. Neither did he. They walked away from that place in silence. The crowd didn't follow. The trader didn't argue. Because some silences are louder than protests. And maybe that's something we should all think about. In a world obsessed with proving power, who talks the loudest, who wins the argument? What if the real power is in presence? In showing up without fanfare, in standing beside someone when no one else will, not because you gain anything, but because it's right. That's what this stranger gave Miriam. Not salvation, not ownership, but space to breathe. And maybe that's all any of us ever needed. To be seen, to be heard, and to walk away from the places that once tried to define us by a number. This is how her journey begins. Not with a rescue, but with a reminder. You are not what they say you are. And someone somewhere will always recognize the value you never lost. Sometimes the most powerful form of healing doesn't come from medicine or words or even rest. It comes from being left alone, gently, respectfully, by someone who sees you not as something broken, but simply human. That was what Miriam found with Tassan. After he walked her out of the trading post, after the dust and noise of that brutal place faded behind them, he didn't say much. He didn't ask where she'd come from. Didn't pry into what had happened. He didn't try to comfort her with false promises or pretend he understood. He just walked, steady, grounded, like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect, and she followed. They didn't stop until the sun had dropped low and the air turned crisp. Hidden between two birch trees tucked behind a mossy ridge was a shelter made of earth and wood. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't large, but it felt intentional, safe, like someone had built it with care, not for show, but for survival. Tassan gestured to the creek nearby. You and the child, he said softly, drink, rest. Simple words. But to Miriam they felt like more than kindness. They felt like an offering. Like she was being given something she hadn't been offered in a long time. A choice. She hesitated, then asked, "Why are you helping me?" He looked at her, not with pity, not with expectation, and replied, "Because you looked at them like they were people, not animals, and because the child did not cry when I spoke." That moment stayed with her, because in a world where so many people had looked at her and seen only weight, risk, shame, here was someone who saw how she looked at others. It wasn't about usefulness, it wasn't about strength, it was about dignity. You know, we don't talk enough about what it means to be recognized quietly, not praised, not celebrated, just seen, truly seen by someone who expects nothing in return. Have you ever experienced that? A moment when someone didn't try to fix you or label you, but simply made space for you to exist without fear? That night, Tassan built a small fire and shared dried meat and flatbread from his pouch. No ceremony, no speech, just a silent agreement between two people with nothing to offer each other but presence. And somehow that was enough. Miriam watched the way he moved, measured, grounded, not rushed. She noticed he didn't flinch when she looked him in the eye, didn't turn away when her silence stretched longer than it should have. He wasn't trying to save her. He was giving her room to breathe. That kind of stillness is rare. Later, as her baby slept curled in her arms, she realized something she hadn't dared to feel in weeks: safety. Not the kind that comes from walls or weapons, but from knowing that for now, no one wanted to take, judge, or own her. And when she looked up at Tassan across the fire, she didn't feel the need to explain who she was or what she had survived. He already knew enough. Because sometimes healing doesn't begin with answers. It begins with someone saying, "You don't owe me a story. You don't owe me anything at all." In that quiet shelter, surrounded by trees that muffled the outside world, Miriam didn't just rest. She remembered what it felt like to exist, without a number on her skirt or a price on her head, and for the first time in a long time she let the fire warm more than her hands. She let it begin to thaw something deeper. Not freedom, not yet, but hope. And hope, as we know, is the root of everything worth building. Freedom is never given, it's claimed. And sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is simply saying no, out loud, in front of those who once assumed you'd never speak. That moment came for Miriam not long after she had begun to feel a sense of quiet in the shelter, a fragile peace nestled deep in the forest. For the first time in what felt like years, she was beginning to breathe without fear. She wasn't healed, not yet, but she was standing. She was becoming. And then, the smoke appeared on the horizon, a thin, dark line in the southern sky, too controlled for a wildfire, too deliberate to ignore. Tassan saw it before she did. His face didn't change, but his body did. It tightened, like a bowstring pulled just enough to hold, but not yet to release. "They're warning us," he said. And that was all it took. She knew who they were, not just men with weapons or uniforms. These were the ones who had claimed her before, who wrote her name down like it belonged in a ledger, who thought papers, contracts, and cruel traditions made her theirs, who believed that walking away wasn't her right, but theft. And now, they had come to reclaim what they thought they'd lost. But Miriam? She wasn't the woman they'd left behind. When they arrived, two men, one in a faded soldier's coat, the other in the same ragged trader's gear. She didn't run. She didn't cry, she didn't plead, she stood. And when they demanded her return, waving documents, invoking laws threatening violence, she answered in the clearest voice they had ever heard from her. "I am not for sale. I am not for return." There was silence. Real silence. The kind that only comes when something sacred is spoken into the open. Have you ever felt that kind of silence? The kind that settles after truth finally stands tall? Miriam told them what the paper couldn't. That the man who claimed her had locked her in a barn, starved her, treated her worse than livestock. That she had never signed anything willingly. That she had been beaten, branded, not with fire, but with silence. The trader laughed at first, still clinging to the script he'd rehearsed for years. "That's not how the system works. You were property. but she didn't flinch. "Then write this down," she said. "I'm not yours, and if you come one step closer, the only name you'll carry home is the one I carve in stone." Power shifted in that instant, not because the men were outnumbered, but because Miriam refused to kneel. And that refusal, that's where real power begins, because sometimes reclaiming your identity doesn't require permission. It requires defiance. This wasn't just a woman defending herself. This was a human being declaring something sacred. I belong to no one but myself. And that truth, it scared them more than her blade ever could. They left, not because she begged, not because Tassan threatened, but because they saw something they didn't expect, a woman who wouldn't hide anymore, a woman who had nothing left to lose but her silence. You see, freedom isn't always loud. It doesn't always ride in on horses or arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks barefoot, bruised, carrying a child on one arm and a fire in the other. Miriam's voice cracked the sky that day, not just for her but for every person who's ever been told they don't own their life. What name do you still carry that was never yours to begin with? And when will you let it burn so that your real one can rise? Because that's what Miriam did. And from that moment on, she didn't just survive, she existed on her own terms. Some people think letting go is easy, that you just walk away, start fresh, close a door, and never look back. But the truth is, letting go is rarely about the walking. It's about what you're still carrying when you leave. Miriam knew that. She'd come so far from the place where they tried to sell her. She had stood her ground. She had looked men in the eye and said, "I don't belong to you." But healing is something deeper. It's not just about escape, it's about release. And sometimes, release needs fire. That night, in the quiet of the shelter Tassan had built, a space that asked nothing from her except her presence, Miriam gathered the last fragments of her old life. The wedding ring, bent, uninscribed, and cold. The scrap of paper that once passed for a marriage contract. The cloth from the trading post that still smelled faintly of fear. Even a torn page from a prayer book, the one that had told her obedience was holiness, that silence was woman's virtue. She laid it all in the fire pit. Have you ever done that? Held something that once meant love or safety or identity, and realized it had become a weight you no longer had to bear? Miriam stared at the flames as they rose. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't grieving, but because grief had changed shape. It wasn't drowning her anymore. It was clearing space, and in that space, something powerful happened. She walked back inside, opened the small leather ledger Tassan had given her, and for the first time, chose how she would name herself. No man's name. No town of birth, no price attached, just this. Miriam, mother of Thomas. That was it. And somehow, it was everything. Because what she was writing wasn't just her identity, it was a declaration. That she was no longer a chapter in someone else's story. That her existence didn't need approval or permission. That motherhood wasn't a weakness and her past wasn't a sentence. It was soil. And from that soil, she could grow again. You know, we live in a world that still tries to define us by what we've been through. Divorced, survivor, single mom, former this, ex that. But what if we got to start fresh? Not erasing the past, but refusing to be contained by it. Miriam didn't erase her history. She didn't deny the pain. But she did something braver. She rewrote her place within it. That fire didn't just burn paper and gold. It burned shame. It burned the story they told about her. And when the ashes settled, she was still there, standing, whole, renamed by her own hand. That kind of freedom, that doesn't show up with flags and music. It's quiet, it's personal, and it's real. When Tassan returned that night, he didn't ask what she had burned, and she didn't explain. Because when someone sees your transformation, they don't need the details. They feel the shift in the air. Later, as she held Thomas close and felt his little fingers curl into her braid, she realized something unexpected. There was space inside her again. Room for breath. Room for future. Room to choose. And for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was living on her own terms. What's still in your fire pit waiting to be burned? What name have you been given that no longer fits? Because sometimes the first step to becoming whole is the courage to say, this story begins with me. Some stories are hard to tell. Not because the words aren't there, but because once spoken they become real in a way that silence had always protected. Late one night, with the fire flickering low and the storm wind brushing against the shelter walls, Tassan finally spoke. Not much, not with drama, just enough. Miriam had asked him a simple question, half in curiosity, half in need. Did you ever have a wife? She asked, not expecting an answer, just wondering if she was the only one walking with ghosts. He looked into the flames, then said, I had a sister. And just like that, the air shifted. Tassan didn't tell the story like someone seeking pity. He told it the way survivors often do, with clarity, with weight, but without collapse. His sister had been taken during a raid, not by strangers, but by men who had promised safety. She was 16. Left behind were beads, blood, and silence that no one knew how to fill. He said they tracked 2 of the men, gave her their names, gave her a knife. She didn't take revenge, he said. She said surviving without becoming like them, that was enough. Have you ever heard something that stops time inside your chest? That was one of those moments, because survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about not letting the worst thing that happened to you decide who you become. And for Tassan, the pain of not being able to protect his sister turned into something else. Purpose. He didn't run from the world. He built shelters in it. Quiet places hidden in woods and ridges for the ones who needed to disappear. Just like she once did. Just like Miriam had. No announcements. No signs. Just a place to land. And when Miriam heard that, she didn't say, thank you. Because it wasn't about gratitude, it was about recognition. They didn't make vows, didn't promise to stay. What they built between them wasn't possession, it was presence. At one point, Tassan said softly, you saved me. But when Miriam shook her head, he replied, no, I only gave you somewhere to land. You were already flying. Isn't that what so many of us are looking for? Not someone to carry us, not someone to own us, but someone who sees we're already moving, already fighting, already surviving. And just hold space for that? They called it a treaty. Not love, not partnership in the traditional sense. A treaty between 2 people who owed nothing to each other, but chose to build something anyway. That line hit me hard. Not a master, just a witness. How often do we confuse love with control, support with direction? What would our relationships look like if we learned to witness more and command less? Tassan didn't rescue Miriam. He didn't own her. He didn't ask her to become anyone other than who she already was. He simply stayed. And by staying, he told her, you don't have to be alone to be free. That night, neither of them spoke much more. But in the silence, something sacred settled. A stillness between 2 people who had been broken in different ways and yet somehow found peace not by fixing each other, but by listening. Who are the witnesses in your life? Who are the people who see you truly without needing to shape or save you? And maybe more importantly, who have you made space for? Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer someone isn't advice, or help, or even love in the way we've been taught. Sometimes it's this. You don't owe me your story, but I'll be here when you're ready to tell it. There comes a moment in every story when the hunted stops running and turns around. Not because they're no longer afraid, but because fear is no longer in control. For Miriam, that moment came just after dawn. The snow had fallen heavy overnight, quieting the forest and masking footsteps. But silence, she'd learned, can be deceptive. It doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means something is coming. And that morning, it did. 2 men. Younger than the others, but colder. Not the kind who threatened with paperwork or laws, but with steel and silence. They didn't shout. They didn't announce themselves. They just appeared, like wolves at the edge of the trees, paid to return her quickly, not gently. Miriam felt them before she saw them. She was grinding roots for tea when Thomas stirred in his sleep, restless. That was the only warning she needed. Years of being chased had taught her to trust the smallest shift in breath, in air, in light. Tassan wasn't there. He'd gone to the spring for water. So this time, she was alone. But not powerless. She didn't panic. She moved. Swift, quiet, deliberate. She placed Thomas in the hollow beneath the shelter floor, covering him with moss. She grabbed the hunting knife Tassan had left by the fire and stepped out into the snow. And there they were. One at the corner of the shelter, hand on the wall like he owned it. The other circling, flanking. He said, "We're here for what doesn't belong to you." Miriam didn't flinch. She stood her ground and replied, "She doesn't belong to anyone. You're looking at her. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone step fully into their power? Not perform strength, but become it? That's what happened in that clearing." When the second man moved to flank her, she didn't back away. She lifted the blade and said, "Take one step closer and I will end the part of your story that includes me." They laughed, but not fully, not confidently. They weren't used to resistance. They were used to surrender. That's when she said it, clearly, calmly, like a truth carved from bone. "I'm a woman with no master. That makes me more dangerous than you'll ever be." And just like that, the ground shifted. Behind them, hooves cracked against frozen dirt. Tassan had returned, bow in hand, arrow drawn. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence did the talking. The men froze. One muttered, "We can come back, with more," and Tassan, steady as stone, said, "Then bring twice as many. You'll still ride away smaller than you came." They left, not because they lost a fight, but because they knew they wouldn't win the next one. And Miriam? She didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She walked to the door, lifted Thomas from his hiding place, held him close, and whispered, "Did you see that? Mama's done hiding." That moment wasn't about heroics. It wasn't about weapons. It was about identity. She had been property, a number, a shadow. A woman passed between men like a coin. But now, she was fire. She was voice. She was herself. It's easy to talk about empowerment like it's a slogan. But real empowerment? It looks like this: standing in front of men who expect you to kneel, and refusing, being hunted, and choosing to fight, carrying a child, and still raising a blade when the moment demands it. Survival is loud. It's heartbeats in your ears, footsteps behind you, decisions made in seconds that stretch for hours. But living is quiet, steady. It's choosing, not just reacting. And that's what Miriam began to do. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't bracing for the next blow. She wasn't hiding. She was building, not with grand plans or loud declarations, but with small, sacred acts. She stitched moccasins from elk hide Tassan had brought back from the hunt, not because she had to, but because her son would need them when he started walking. She sorted roots by purpose: pain, relief, fever, sleep, laying each bundle with care on a shelf she built from pine branches. And one morning, without fanfare, she opened the leather ledger and wrote a second name beneath her own: Thomas Elijah. It wasn't about lineage, it wasn't about legacy, it was about belonging, because names, when chosen, aren't just labels. They're declarations. In that moment, Thomas wasn't just her son. He was part of something they were shaping together: a future, a life, a home. Have you ever felt that shift? That moment when surviving no longer feels like enough, and something inside you says, now it's time to live. That's where Miriam was. Tassan saw it too. One evening, while the snow piled against the corners of the shelter, he sat beside the fire, sharpening his knife, and said, almost casually, "This place, it doesn't have to be temporary." She looked at him, and he continued, "I'm not asking to stay and take. I'm asking to build something with you. A treaty, not of land or law, but of choice." She didn't answer right away. Not because she was unsure, but because it was so rare to be asked instead of expected. And that word, treaty, it carried weight. Not a promise made under pressure. Not a vow wrapped in possession, but an agreement between equals. You see, Tassan wasn't asking to own anything. He wasn't even asking to be loved in return. He was asking to be part of something where no one had to lose in order for someone else to belong. He said, "This home has no master, only witnesses." That line stayed with her, because so many of us grow up thinking love means sacrifice, that partnership means control, that home means hierarchy. But what if it didn't? What if real love is not about claiming space, but making room? Miriam didn't say yes or no that night. She didn't have to. The way she passed him the ledger, left open to the line where both names were now written, was enough. He read it, nodded, then added his own line beneath hers. "Then I will witness it until my last breath." They didn't need fireworks or music. The fire in the hearth, the breath of a sleeping child, and the wind whispering through pine was enough. Miriam was no longer just safe. She was rooted. She had gone from being a number in someone else's record to writing her own name in a book no one else could edit, from hunted to homemaker, from hiding to healing, from surviving to living. What would your life look like if no one owned your story but you? What if your home had no master, only people willing to witness your becoming? Because that's what happened here. This wasn't a love story in the traditional sense. This was a freedom story, a quiet revolution, a home built not from stone but from consent, and in a world where people are still bought, still silenced, still expected to shrink to fit someone else's mold, maybe that's the boldest kind of life we can live. There's a moment, usually quiet, when a child looks up and asks a question you're never quite ready to answer. Not because you don't know the truth, but because you finally realize how much of it they're ready to carry. For Miriam, that moment came when Thomas was 6. He was standing next to the worn leather ledger that held their names, the only names that mattered. His tiny finger traced the ink slowly, thoughtfully. And then he asked, "Mama, why doesn't it say who bought you?" Miriam didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She wiped her hands clean of flour, knelt beside him, and answered with a voice steady as the winter outside, "Because no one ever did." Let that sit for a moment. Because this wasn't just a mother speaking to her son. This was a woman naming her freedom in front of the one life that had always seen her as whole. Thomas looked puzzled. "But the man who brought you here, didn't he own you?" She smiled gently and shook her head. "No, baby. He saw too many people treated like things, and he knew I wasn't one of them." And from there, the story flowed, not out of bitterness, but clarity. She told him everything about the trading post, the number written on her skirt, the way the crowd laughed when she clutched her baby tight, and the moment the noise stopped, when a man in buckskin stepped from the shadows and said, "I'll take her, with the child." She told him how that man never asked for her past, never demanded her name, never gave orders, only asked if she wanted water. How he taught her that survival was only the beginning, that voice doesn't have to be loud to be powerful, that sometimes standing up isn't about defiance, it's about deciding you're done being small. And year after year, as snow gathered on the roof and the fire cracked in the hearth, she told that story again and again, not because she needed to remember, but because he needed to understand where he came from. Not from weakness, not from shame, but from the woman who refused to kneel, from the fire that never asked permission to burn. You see, not every woman born into silence stays quiet. Some, like Miriam, become the storm that drives silence out. And that storm doesn't destroy. It clears. It makes room for something new. And here's what makes this more than just a personal story. It's a universal one. Because we all come from something. A name we didn't choose. A past we didn't ask for. A system that tried to assign us a place. But we also have the power to write ourselves out of those roles. To say, that may have been where I started, but it's not where I end. Miriam didn't pass on her trauma, she passed on her truth, and Thomas? He didn't inherit her pain, he inherited her strength. That ledger by the fire became more than a list of names. It became a record of resistance, a living reminder that identity is not given. It is chosen, authored, lived. What part of your story still belongs to someone else? What truth have you not yet passed on, because you weren't sure you could bear to say it out loud? Because somewhere in the quiet, someone's listening. And your voice, once whispered, might become the very thing they need to rise, just like Miriam's did. And as the snow kept falling, soft and endless outside that little shelter, her fire never dimmed. Because some stories don't need to be shouted. They just need to be told until they burn bright enough to light someone else's way.